I'm Steve Goldman. I'm director of the Center for Free Enterprise. And this is our second event of the Menard Family Lecture Series, and it's also our BB&T lecture for 2021-2022, which was supposed to be last year. BB&T is now Truist Bank. Coming on November 15th at 4:30 in this auditorium will be McGat Wade, and she's going to talk about better lives through business. So a few house cleaning ideas here. If you're undecided on your major, you should be majoring in economics, of course. So you can, and the nice thing is you can do a BA degree through arts and sciences, or you can do a BS degree through the business school. Either way, you can get the econ degree. Jobs are pretty good in the economics area. You can earn a lot of money. Also, you might want to minor in entrepreneurship. We have a really nice entrepreneurship minor open to any students in the university. When you came in, you received a survey. We'd like for you to complete those surveys. We use that information to figure out who to bring in as speakers. Also, if you're getting extra credit, you definitely need to fill out the survey and make sure you put your name on the survey and your professor's name and the class it is for. The center also has reading groups, and we read 3 books a semester and meet to discuss the books, have a nice dinner. Oftentimes people in the reading group get to go out with our speakers and have a really nice lunch or dinner also. So if you're interested in doing that, mark on the survey that you would like to be on the email list. Finally, I guess we're ready to start. So today we're very fortunate to have in town Bob Luddy. He's a business and educational entrepreneur. He's president and founder of Captive Air Systems, the nation's leading manufacturer of commercial kitchen ventilation systems. You walk into any restaurant in the United States, and the odds are it's going to be one of his systems doing the ventilation. He's got a lot of the market. More recently, his company's branched into the HVAC systems with Paragon, which gives you exceptional energy savings and much better comfort than we've ever had in this building. And in fact, had we had his system in this building last year, we wouldn't have had to wear the silly mask. That's how good the system is. Well, we still would have had to, but nonetheless, we wouldn't have needed to wear them. Not only has Bob started Captive Air, he's also an education entrepreneur. In 1998, he established Franklin Academy, which was a public charter school in Wake Forest, and then in 2007, he started the Thales Academy. And that's a more of a private school for low-income students. And last month, he actually started Thales College and has several students enrolled in that, and I'm sure it's going to be a great success. So I'm really happy to have Bob here, and I hope you guys will give him a nice round of applause.
Thank you very much. Hello. So first of all, thank you very much for coming today. It's always an honor and a joy to be with you. The students and the professors at the University of Louisville are always very interesting to be around, sparking a lot of new ideas. And so today's topic is regulation, but I threw innovation on top of it because there's a tension between innovation and regulation. And more importantly, what this type of topic does is to cause you to think much deeper about both particularly regulation and its impact on regulation. So most of us know that innovation is the way we increase our standard of living, our quality of life. It's the way we grow in humanity. And innovation affects most every individual. You know, if you think about the iPhone or many technologies that have come along, everybody benefits from them. And if you look back over the last couple of hundred years, we went from almost 90% of individuals growing food to now less than 2%. That occurred because of innovation, and that innovation continues. And if you looked even broader and said that individuals involved in processing that food, selling, distributing, it's about 10% of the population. So 10% of the population can feed everybody in America, but they can also feed people around the world. That's a result of innovation, and it's profound when you think about it. I don't know if any of you know Julian Simon. He's passed on, but he was a really good economist, and he left us with this book called The Ultimate Resource is the Human Mind. So essentially what he's saying that it doesn't matter what the problem is, and think about this personally and also professionally. Every problem can be solved by mankind over time. Some problems take a lot longer, some are more challenging, but over time, man has the ability to solve every single problem. And in your lifetime, in real time, you're seeing tremendous innovation, particularly in the IT, information technology, but also in medical technology. And I should give a plug for HVAC also, we'll talk about. So Julian Simon should give you hope for the future, that whatever the frustrations are at a current point in time, they will be resolved over time. I've lived a little longer than most of you, and I've seen that change over the years. If you think about this Wall Street Journal story that ran about 2 weeks ago, federal officials who actually are in charge of regulation are investing in companies that they regulate. In the private sector, what do we call that? Insider trading, right? You go to jail for that. But in the public sector, they're actually doing that. And you could say, well, that's a couple one-off people, you know, fringe. Well, that's not what the data says. So according to the journal, 2,600 individuals, 50 agencies, 20% of senior managers in government who regulate are buying trading stocks, options, shorting stocks in companies they regulate. How would you feel like if you were on the other side of that equation? It wouldn't feel good, would it? That these people had that level of control over you. If you think about COVID, Scott Gottlieb was the leader of the FDA. He's making the rules. He's got a lot of influence as the leader. And Pfizer just plucks him out of there and says, well, we can pay you twice as much money to be a director. And guess what? You don't have to do a lot. Just show up at directors' meetings. And that's exactly what happened. And somewhat almost concurrent with that change, the COVID vaccine came along. And I should note that COVID vaccine is not a vaccine as we know vaccines. So if we get the polio vaccine, we're not going to get polio, and everybody knows that. But the COVID vaccine, whatever it is, you still can get COVID. We have much evidence of that. So it's not an absolute vaccine as we know it, so we should think about it differently. Remember, that's part of our exercise of what we're doing today. So Scott Gottlieb can not only get paid from Pfizer, but he can go on CNBC and virtually every single day pound the table on why we should all be vaccinated and how scary COVID is and ditto. If you think about the impact on our society, it's enormous. You're living it right now with 8% inflation, with shortage of workers, with a confluence of problems that will take a good amount of time to resolve. Did anybody ever hear the Jones Act? Some of you did. 1917, the Jones Act was passed, and essentially that said that if you want to move goods from one port to another in the U.S., it's got to be American flagged, American ship. Now, these protective regulations might seem okay at the time, but what's the result? Essentially, we don't have a shipbuilding industry, a private shipbuilding industry, because there's only a limited amount of freight that's going to move around our country. And because is very high, alternate sources, planes, truck, airplanes, other methodology is going to be used to move it around. So there's really no need to expand the American fleet. And since they're used to very high prices, can't compete internationally. So think about all the implications from this act. Now, you would think in private industry, if this was passed in 1917, I would hope by 1920, worst case, we got rid of it. We'd recognize this doesn't make any sense. It's not working, but here we are. 105 years later, there's no real move afoot. But it gets a little bit better. So Puerto Rico has a hurricane. They need medical, they need foodstuffs. They need all kinds of construction equipment. And either there's not enough American ships to haul it down there or the cost is too high, some combination thereof. So the administration allows for a period of time, I don't know the exact time, maybe 90 days, we cannot follow the Jones Act. So think about this. When it's really important, it's abolished. But in reality, it's really important all the time in terms of cost and service and competitiveness within our society. So bad legislation and bad regulations tend to exist in perpetuity. That's a big problem. So anytime we think about, wouldn't it be great to have this regulation? How long is it going to last? What are the implications of that regulation? Now, one of my themes is regulation inhibits innovation. And we already discussed that innovation is critical to our health, safety, and personal growth for everybody. Very often you see leading producers are in cahoots with trade organizations and the government. They're happy to have regulation because it insulates them from competition. Recently, I read that the HVAC industry, and that means 3 or 4 major players and maybe some regulatory people, all agreed on new regulation. Well, they didn't agree on it because it was going to cause them severe competition. They agreed on it because it would restrict competition, okay? So whenever you have, if you want to go back to 1820, it's called the American system. The founders didn't want any relationship between business and government. It's like you and the judge. We can't really have a relationship because the judge is making a decision. That's the more ideal way. If you're in cahoots and you're going out to dinner with the judge and you're a bosom buddy, there's not going to be a fair trial. We know that. So if industry is working closely with government, it's a problem. And you can see that problem in virtually every industry. Samuel Grabe is a PhD, moral philosopher, market economy individual. And he recently wrote a book touting the fact that regulation undermines American competitiveness. So as you put more and more regulations on companies, it retards innovation, makes it much more difficult. So think about if you're Boeing and you want to change a part, you have to get approval, and that approval might take years. So eventually what happens is the engineers say, it's going to take so much, unless it's some profound need, we're just not going to change anything. And now Airbus has overtaken Boeing. Surprising that the European regulators couldn't take Airbus down, but they didn't. So we lost our position as the lead. Now there's other reasons, bad management, et cetera, but regulation plays a role here, and regulation also didn't keep those planes that went down safe. So we tend to think of regulation as absolute keeping us safe, but we can cite many examples where it does not keep us safe. And I think we need to be very worried. If we were sitting here in 1970, we'd be less worried about international competition. Anybody that's not worrying about it today is not paying attention. Even the Germans, who have had a long run of exports, are being severely challenged around the world by many other countries and change in economic conditions. This is a little example from our own industry. In about 1960, these fire suppression systems were designed, and they're a bottle of chemical. Now it's a bottle of a different type of chemical. But the technology really has not changed in almost 60 years. And according to Homeland Security, of all the restaurant fires around the country, these systems were able to put out the fire 7% of the time. So does anybody think here you could sell a product in the market that was effective 7% of the time? Absolutely not, right? But it's code mandated, and because it's code mandated, the cost has gone up 4 or 5-fold in the last 40 years. So you're paying an enormous cost for something that's not going to work. That's a failure of regulation. I will point out that Captive Air has challenged that, and we've brought 2 new systems into the market that are highly effective. They use entirely new technology. They're supervised, they're modern aged. But even with new technology, it takes a while to overcome the inertia in the market. So when you have regulation, you retard growth because people become very satisfied with the status quo, and even when it doesn't work, they just don't pay attention. This is what the code says. Now, for most of your lifetime, natural gas was considered the clean fossil fuel. And it was always presented as clean fossil fuel. But the Californians decide it's not clean enough, and they're going to ban nat gas from future use. So instead of having natural gas to heat your home, they're going to use natural gas in a power plant, make power, send it to your home. Does anybody think that's efficient? It's not efficient. We know that. In the state of North Carolina, you're not allowed to sell gasoline for cars less than cost. What's the idea of this? Eliminate competition. So there's always gas stations that want to sell at or below cost because they want you to come to their store and buy stuff, and that's where they really make their money. Again, it inhibits competition, and if you sell below cost, the competitors will file a lawsuit and saying you're doing something illegal. This is not a way you promote lower cost, and gasoline cost is really important to average people. It's really important to all people. If you think about Department of Education, so President Carter did some good things and bad things. This is one that he didn't handle so well. So he creates a federal Department of Education. Now keep in mind, prior to that time, for 120, 30 years, education was mostly very local. There were state controls, but now we have this gigantic Department of Federal Education. And they're engaged in every aspect of education that you can think about. And they're making local decisions very difficult because they're overriding with very blanket regulations. Now, does anybody think that education is better today than 1970? There may be some aspects of it, but in general, education is not as good. And for those college students who are paying a high price to go to college, you're probably paying about 2x what you would have paid had there never been a Department of Education. So it's coming right home to roost. So what sounds like a good thing, we'll create these regulators, and you should know that most often when they hire regulators, sometimes they perceive to know what they're doing, sometimes they're so-called experts, sometimes they don't know anything about what they're regulating. So they have to go through years of learning to regulate people who actually know what they're doing. So you think this thing thoroughly, how are you going to get good results there? Also, at the federal level in particular, they often exceed their mandates. So this has been going on for years. One person I know told a regulator, you're exceeding your legislative mandate. And here's what the regulator told him: that's not how we view it. See the mentality coming out of them? That's not how we look at it. Well, the EPA got a little lesson recently from SCOTUS where they were overruled and said, you've exceeded your legislative authority in West Virginia. And I think you're probably going to see more of those upcoming. And that's a good thing, because at very least we're saying if it's passed through legislation, it's regulation enough, let's not enhance it, let's not make it bigger. Who here ever heard of the Interstate Commerce Commission? Mostly you probably never heard of it. We got a few hands up there because it went out of business in 1995. If you went back to the late 1800s, the railroads would fix prices, but everybody would cheat. So they came up with a new scheme, and the Interstate Commerce was formed. And the Interstate Commerce Commission fixed prices legally. So now you can't cheat. So the effect was they could charge very excessive prices for long periods of time, and it was legal. And it lasted from 1887. And here's something President Carter actually did well. He began to get rid of these price controls even in the 70s. But even with Carter saying, we've got to get rid of this ICC, it's anti-competitive, it's a terrible thing, it took till long after he was gone in 1995. And some of you may know better, but I know of very few federal agencies that have ever been banished and don't exist anymore. This is one. I'll challenge you to find another one. So reforms that began in the mid-'70s took 20 years to get done, even though there was a consensus in general. This is a bad outcome. Prior to 1960, the FDA only had one mission: to make sure that drugs would do no harm. Made sense. They didn't speak to the efficacy of the drugs. That was considered a market opportunity. Well, when politicians get elected, they always have ideas. Most of them are pretty goofy. But they have their idea and they want to advocate for it. So we have a politician says, well, we have to determine whether the efficacy of the drug. Well, you know what, that process is now 10 years down line to get a drug approved. So then you have fights over patents, a lot of things, and then it gets approved for a specific use. Another use is found, but it's not approved, okay? So now you have another process to get secondary approvals, even though that secondary use may be highly beneficial, and it's known to be highly beneficial. So there was a group that put together, I think it was Darcy Olson out of the Arizona think tank. It's called the Right to Try movement. So you have cancer, you're gonna die in 90 days. Merck says, well, we have this drug, but it's not approved, but we think you could live another 90 days or a year. The Right to Try said, we ought to have the right to try it and see how it works. And it's also part of your clinical trials. And since I'm dying, I'm willing to take a risk, okay? Well, the regulators kiboshed that, because if they participated in it, then the FDA regulators saying, you're kind of moving off the reservation here, we're gonna make it a little extra hard for you. You'll learn that the regulators are boss, okay? So the idea that you could try drugs that may be helpful was just essentially kiboshed. These are kind of side stories, but they're important insights into regulation. Think about nuclear power. You could love it or hate it, but the regulators regulated nuclear power out of business for all intent and purposes. If you look at France, a large amount of their power comes from nuclear power, and it's been very effective over the years. Any type of power generation is going to have positives and negatives. The negative in nuclear power primarily is it uses a lot of water. That's a negative impact. Over time, remember what Julian Simon told us, that problem will be solved. So if we were building nuclear plants over the last 50 years, that problem would have been solved by someone somewhere. But since we're not, we're nowhere, and we really don't have very effective ways of building plants because of regulation, because the technology is not advancing, when the regulators are going to make it very, very costly, and it doesn't work. So we talked about California. They want to ban natural gas. For those of you who don't know, if you have a heat pump, it delivers the air maybe in the 85-degree range. So we can get the room to eventually to 72, but sensibly, 85-degree air blowing out doesn't feel good, it feels cold, and it always feels cold, and it never changes. Also, if you happen to live in Louisville, when the temperature goes below 40 degrees, the heat pump is degrading. So an HVAC manufacturer say, well, we get value all the way down to 0. We don't really believe that. And there may be some value, there is some value below 40, but it's not enough to keep you warm. So what has to happen? Strip heaters have to be added. The most expensive type of heat is strip heat, electric strip heat. And keep in mind, the power has to be generated from coal and nat gas and who knows what, for the most part. You can say, well, green energy is going to take care of that problem, but that technology has not matured yet. So it's a good idea to have green energy, but we have to be able to produce green energy, and currently we can't do it reliably. So California is going to put this tremendous burden. Nat gas is going to disappear. Gets a little worse. California does not have the production capacity for all the electricity that they need, so they have to buy it from other places. And those other places are mostly coal-burning operations. I'm bringing these points up just to cause you to think a little bit more deeply about regulation. And if you were the regulator, or if you were the innovator, the scientist, how would you handle it? Now, most of you remember, it was about September of last year, President Carter mandated all companies over 100 employees would be required to get the vaccine, regardless of anything. And so my position at Captive Air is we're not going to be ordered to take this vaccine, which, by the way, is not a vaccine, and is opposed by many of our employees. This is kind of a freedom, free choice issue. What is America about? It's about freedom primarily. Why are we the most creative company on the planet and have been for 200 years? We have more freedom. It's not complicated. So American exceptionalism, the term's out of favor, stems from freedom, plain and simple. So people come from all over the planet, they come to America, and when they're free, they're more inventive. We see evidence of that all over the planet. So 5 Captive Air employees joined with the Liberty Justice Center out of Chicago and filed a suit in the Fifth Circuit down in Louisiana. And the Fifth Circuit was filed at noon on the day that the OSHA put the final order out. You must now be in compliance today. They asked the Fifth Circuit on a Friday afternoon to rule on this, and the Fifth Circuit ruled Saturday, and they put a stay on the vaccine. Subsequently, that stay was released by the Sixth Circuit in Cincinnati, but ultimately the Supreme Court said no. Biden administration and OSHA, you do not have the regulatory authority to make everybody in this country take a vaccine. So we won that battle. I should point out that one of our second-tier suppliers, September 1, when the order was issued, they issued an order, all employees will get the vaccine. Guess what happened? About a third of the employees left. This was a company that produces high-tech computer boards. These are very high-skilled people. You don't replace them tomorrow morning. And as a result, the customers, this company was unable to produce and handle all their customers, so they lost half their production capacity. And customers had to scurry to get other board manufacturers, and very likely that company could go out of business over this issue. So every one of these issues has profound consequences. If you look at the state of New York has a permanent mandate that you must have a vaccine if you're a healthcare worker or you're a teacher. What are the results? During a period of COVID, when we need every healthcare worker on the planet, 34,000 were discharged by the state of New York, 34,000 healthcare workers, 8,000 teachers. So America's desperate for really good teachers, and we're kicking them to the side because they're not in compliance with, what do they call it, the science. And we all know the science is dubious just from casual observations. Now, supposing the 18th Amendment was passed in 2022, it might have a little impact on the University of Louisville and some of the students who might occasionally want to have a beer. And what was the idea of this amendment? It was people would work harder, we would have an improved society, everything would be better if we just got rid of alcohol. That was the whole idea. Well, what happened? Organized crime showed up, okay? Very serious crime problems, which took almost 100 years to get rid of. Took tremendous battles, tremendous loss of life. Alcoholism became more prevalent. Illegal sales were everywhere. You could only get it through illegal methodology. So all these people were breaking the law. They're becoming alcoholics, mafia shooting people up. And what did American citizens say? Enough. And it was repealed in 1933. So good intentions don't always bring about good outcomes. And those outcomes have to be thought through very carefully. At Captive Air, every decision we make, we think through the very long-term consequences. And it doesn't mean we make them all perfectly. But if we're wrong, we adjust very quickly, and et cetera. So thankfully, you guys don't have to worry about the 18th Amendment. I don't think it's coming back. You're in good shape. Now think about if you're going to design a new school, you hire a professional licensed engineer and architect. They're licensed by the state to design buildings per the codes. And yet if you submit plans, with the schools we build, it can take 2 years, and we have some now that are taking 3 years after the licensed engineer presents to the municipality the plans that they said they require. These are the plans that are with code. It's an endless process. And more recently, they're requiring us to put in about $400,000 of landscaping. So think about it, you're building a school for a K-5 and you're putting $400,000 in landscaping. I grew up where you bought a little thing of seeds for 50 cents, and in time they produce flowers or trees or whatever. So the only difference between really good landscaping is the time. If you have to buy really big trees, they're really expensive. So they want the buildings to open up like they've been there for 20 years. But the cost burden is enormous. And the purpose of the school is to educate kids. It's not to have nice landscaping. That's a nice thing to have. I'm all in for it. But is it worth $400,000? Is anybody familiar with the term rent-seeking? Hopefully you are, because you have good economic professors. Very often we see this rent-seeking with industries trying to gain advantage for their product, their technology, trying to crowd out other areas. So this is a long-term problem. Now, you all know Frederick Bastiat. Have they all read the law? If you haven't read the law, you can Google it. The Law by Frederick Bastiat. It's on a PDF. It's a very short book. It's very profound. And the book was written in 1850 by a Frenchman, Bastiat. And he says, we know what is seen. We know what's right in front of us. We know what we think the results will be. But we don't know what's unseen, the secondary, the tertiary, the long-term impacts of what we do. So as economists, business people, engineers, we need to think of the long-term impacts. And very often in regulation, nobody ever thought of any of the tertiary, secondary, long-term impacts and how it impacts our competitiveness as a country. Now, this idea of bringing outside air, so there was Legionnaire's disease, you'll probably all remember, it was 1978, Philadelphia. Maybe 100 people got killed from the HVAC system. So somebody said, mostly AMCO, hey, we need to bring in outside air, and we need to have better duct systems, ditto. But it kind of languished, and there were some provisions that required more outside air. But the game was to bring as little as possible. So essentially, nobody took it seriously. But finally, ASHRAE, we had some level of involvement, began to pound the table. Technologies are emerging that allow very superior HVAC systems. And Dr. Stanley Muma from Penn State University, and this shows the power of one person, theorized what a direct outside air unit would do. Now, keep in mind, he only does the theory. That's what you do at the university. Someone's got to take that theory and convert it into a real product. But Muma created perfect theory of how the system would work. And concurrently, the technologies, which include scroll compressors, which modulate 10 tons down to 2.5 tons, advanced electronics, advanced refrigeration, advanced coils that can get that humidity out under the worst conditions and do it efficiently, and can provide up to 100% clean air in the building. So if the University of Louisville said, we want 100% outside air in this building, we could do it with this technology. But more than likely, they would say we want about 15 to 20% outside air currently flowing in the building, filtered to a high standard of MERV 13. And essentially, you make the inside more like the outside. So at Thales Academy, we put all these systems in. We were able to open in July of 2020. because we had clean, fresh outside air. Parents began to understand it. Fast forward 2 years later, everybody understands the way to prevent COVID and many other viruses is to keep that air fresh and clean, keep it moving versus churning. So when it churns, you're getting more and more viruses in that same area, and as that intensity moves up, that's when it passes along. When you can dilute a virus, you minimize the impact. That's what DOAS does. This is a leading edge technology. We're engaged in it. There's about 6 US producers. It's going to change the world. When the regulators get a chance, they'll see how they can regulate it, but right now they can't do it. Exit is a powerful concept that says we're going to do things entirely differently. DOAS is an entirely new concept of HVAC, provides the cleanest air, highly filtered, humidity control under virtually all conditions. If you think about Uber is the ultimate exit. Are they a taxi company? Not exactly. Are they a software company? Mostly. Nobody can exactly figure out they were. What they have done, they're consumer friendly. They've made taxi and transportation better. Everything about it is better. What does the regulators think about that? Well, they want to force the drivers. Some drivers just drive Saturday afternoon for fun. They still pay their taxes. They get a 1099. They have to pay the tax. But that's not good enough for the regulators. They want them to be employees. These people don't want to be employees. It may be a conflict with the employment contract they have now, but they could be an independent and do something on the weekend. Nobody cares. So the regulators are relentless, and they actually don't like innovation unless they control it. 33% of all jobs in the US require a license to work. So 1/3 of the people need a license. If you move from one state to the other, they may have reciprocity, but it takes time for that reciprocity to be approved. So if you're a teacher, they're going to give you a 1-year delay before you can work. Think of military families. They move every year or two. The spouse can't work because they can't get reciprocity. So on the surface, it sounds good. Well, we have reciprocity in Kentucky, North Carolina, we're all friends. Yeah, let the bureaucrats get a hold of it and find out what happens. Changing regulation is painfully slow. If you look at our industry, it took 50 years to make major changes. We're now in a pretty good place. But what happened to those 50 years? Were we energy efficient? No, they were creating energy inefficiencies. Were the inside of those restaurants healthy in those kitchens? Absolutely not. Today they are, because manufacturers like Captive Air have changed the game. So what is my proposal? Do no harm. It's fine for the regulators to say do no harm, but effectively that's already done in tort law, under common law. Most everything you can think about it is covered under common law. If you cause harm, you're going to get sued. There's going to be compensation. So general regulation, don't do any harm, keep the air clean. You figure out how to keep it clean, but as long as you keep it clean, you pass the regulation. I'm for. I am not for specific and crippling regulation. If you look in the HVAC industry, there's many agencies, UL, ETL, that create standards. We test the standards, and the regulators accept those standards. Those are good standards, and they're universal, and they're required. So industries that work together with independent agencies produce good results. And I'll close with human progress rests on the expansion capacity to its utmost and many people as possible so that we can become truly morally free. So America's greatness is based on freedom. And the more freedom we have, the more we're going to invent. There's going to be problems. There's going to be exceptions. There's going to be bad people. You're never going to get rid of bad people. And that's some books I used in terms of reference. We also talked at our lunch and dinner about both business, economics, physics. They're all very congruent when you think about it. So I suggest that you try to learn as much about every one of those disciplines as you can. And I'll close now for questions. Thank you.
If you have questions, please go up to the microphone and ask.
It always takes the first brave person to walk up there. And now we have one.
Bob, Daniel Bennett, I'm actually Steve's colleague at the Center for Free Empires. Thank you for coming out and joining us and sharing with us all this great information. My question is actually about, you said during your talk that when companies and industries work together with government regulators, that's collusion, that's going to lead to bad outcomes. But then you ended saying when they work together in private organizations, that can be good. Can you explain why we would expect a different outcome than collusive outcomes that limit competition when industry is working with a regulator versus when they're working with each other in a private organization?
It's interesting with these private groups. They're fairly, it's not 100%, but they're very independent. So if you have an ANSI standard, it's usually put together by professional engineers, which are outside of the manufacturing community. Or if you have an ASTM standard, or sometimes they come out of the university. So University of Minnesota, Penn State, and many other universities create a standard. They get ANSI or ASTM to accept that standard, and then everybody tests under the standard. So there's competition among the groups, and there's not any cozy relationship for the most part. There could be in some cases, but generally those standards are pretty good, and you tend to have more of a fight among individuals. So if I came to the University of Louisville and you're putting a standard together, you don't really care whether it pleases me, but you may care about good information I bring to you. So I'd say overall it works pretty darn well. The government thing tends to be more sloppy because if you look at UL, it's run by engineers. We have disagreements with them. ETL, they're run by engineers. ANSI, all these standards, they're all professional engineers. It just works better. And they know what they're talking about when they produce these standards.
Hello, my name is Barry Kerr. I'm currently pursuing a BA in economics. And my question is, what's the role of government in fundamental research? That is finding and such as new technologies, and whether or not the government should offer subsidies such as education for physics or let's say medicine. And that's in particular relation to what you said about 100% clean air. And fundamentally, I'm just wondering what's your opinion on where the government can come in and make things better?
I'd probably go back to Calvin Coolidge and say the least intervention absolutely possible. If you went back prior to 1950, articles tended to be not peer reviewed. When the government got involved, they had to be peer reviewed. So you might say, well, peer review, what's wrong with that? Here's what's wrong with it. It again stifles innovation. So we, about 2 years ago, we wrote a lot of articles and they're peer reviewed and they're posted in ASHRAE and other publications. But we always were being pushed by people who wanted to maintain the status quo. So 2 years ago, we sent a letter to every customer, every engineer in the country and said, we no longer do peer review articles. Our articles, every white paper we put out is a recognizance of captive air systems. And you can either agree with this or not agree with this. If you don't agree with this, that's free choice. And we had an overwhelmingly positive response because those engineers and those users know that we're going to bring innovation to them. And maybe there's some inherent risk with any innovation, but it's working beautifully for us. So when the government becomes involved, politics is involved. That's the problem. And maybe that's something I should have answered earlier. There's politics in everything, but government is all about politics. And when you have politics involved, Kierkegaard has a white paper, and it's called No Truth in the Crowd. What is the government? It's the mob. It's the crowd. That's the problem. So in my mind, no government intervention.
Thank you.
Some of you may disagree.
So my question is, if we're not supposed to be regulating specific industries, how do we account for negative or externalities that are created in a process of like business and such?
Well, I think it's fine to regulate kind of general things like you can do no harm with drugs. In the case of buildings, you could say, you could have a regulation that the air has to be clean to a standard, a Nancy standard or another standard. But you could figure out different ways of getting to that point. So if you look at cleaning the environment, there's 3 or 4 technologies, and there may be other technologies on the way. As long as you can meet a standard, that's basically what all this testing is. To me, that's the way you do it. But how you meet that standard allows for innovation. If you say that you can only do it with X defined technology, that's where the problem comes in. Because then how do we advance as a society?
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ethan, and you very briefly touched on how economics can be related to physics, and one thing I kind of thought about is how it takes a long time to kind of build like a Jenga tower, but it takes, like, you can knock it over in one swift motion. To contrast, why do you think it is so much harder or just as complicated to start the process of deregulating as it is to regulate?
Because regulation, if you know anything about the federal government particularly, they not only don't want to give up power, they want to expand their power. So if you look at CDC, they're engaged in all types of activities that they should not be involved in, which is one of the reasons why they're not as good at CDC work as they were 10, 15 years ago. So federal bureaucrats never want to give up power. In business and industry, we may be the same, but we got a competitor like this standing over there ready to eat our lunch. We got to change, we got to move. So there's no competition within government. There's severe competition within industries, providing that you allow inventors and thinkers and entrepreneurs to be creative. And if you shut that off, then inertia takes over and it's very hard to break. So if you look at breaking into new industries, it takes very tough, smart people to do it. It took us 40 years to master kitchen ventilation to get it to a point where we wanted to be way back when. Now, some of that's because there's other supporting technologies that now exist that didn't exist 40 years ago. But if you look at changing the standard, because of COVID, there's a rapid adoption of DOS technology. But if it didn't exist, what these industries are going to say, this is good enough for those people. And what the innovator, the scientist says, no, it's not good enough. We want to move to a higher standard. So in all cases, we should look to say, how can we move to higher standards and maintain safety and quality of life? As long as we're not doing anybody any harm, we should be allowed to innovate and move to higher standards. And really, that's what America's about.
Oh, I'm shorter than everyone else. Not a big surprise. So I'd like to say I agree with probably 90% of what you're saying, sir. I'm an entrepreneur myself. I'm the daughter of an entrepreneur. And I'm a homeschooler, so I strongly believe in a lot of changes to our K through 12 education. But when I'm looking at some of these things, you're talking about removing as much regulation as possible, which again, there's a lot to be said for that. But we're coming back to the question of negative externality. They're not always captured by market forces. You're talking about California, which is essentially turning its use of fossil fuels into a negative externality for other states. They're saying, we're not going to have fossil fuels burnt in our state. You can burn it in your state. We'll just take your energy. So they're actually transferring it to someone else entirely. So the question comes, how do you capture those kinds of negative externalities? You have situations where you have an extremely large company. Let's take Amazon as an example, which is able to outcompete other companies and keep them out of the marketplace simply without any regulation. And we haven't yet figured out how to regulate things like Amazon and Walmart in a way that is both fair and effective for the economy, as well as fair and effective for new companies that are trying to enter the marketplace. These are all areas that we aren't really sure how to approach yet. And I'm not entirely sure that entirely removing a regulation is the entire way to go about this. I'd like to hear your thought on that. I do have to, as a biologist, I'm a microbiologist by training, have to correct your science slightly. The COVID vaccines are indeed vaccines. They're just using different technology, and personally, I would have preferred to see that technology tested for another 10 or 15 years before we introduced it to all of us. However, there is not a single vaccine that any of us have ever had in this room, that any of our parents have ever had, including the smallpox vaccine, that is 100% effective. Almost all of them have a breakthrough rate that is far higher than any of us would like to believe. Some are as little effective in preventing initial infections. Forget about preventing disease, but preventing infection at all. It's what you're talking about. And preventing disease, they can be as low as 50%. We approve vaccines at a much easier standard than we do anything else. However, the reduction in people dying is worth it to those who are willing to take the vaccine. I take your point that we shouldn't be forced to and we should make those choices. But I'm really interested in how you think we can capture those externalities that are really being essentially shoved off into other areas and are not easily captured simply by market forces.
Thanks for the information on the vaccine. And if you think about it, I think it was about 2 years ago, there was a point in time on Wall Street where Wall Street just says there's not going to be any retail anywhere. Retail is over. Walmart, you're done. Every little retail store, you're done. And then what gradually happened, Kroger's still in business. So the answer is competition. So there has to be competition to regulate private industry. If they're able to snuff out competition, then the most important regulator, competition, is gone. Now you're seeing a secondary effect. Amazon's overexpanding. They built many more warehouses than they need. How silly it is you're going to go from one corporate headquarters in Washington to 3. One's going to be in New York, one's going to be in DC, then it moves to Nashville. Basically, they're overexpanding. So Jeff Bezos, he's out. He's doing other things. And now you're seeing Amazon have to retrench. And also because of COVID, you have a shortage of workers. So the opportunity for workers has increased geometrically in just a 2-year window. People are paying more money. They're creating better conditions. We never air conditioned our plants because, one, the technology was too expensive. In the last 3 years, or 4 years, every plant we have is air conditioned to the same standard as your office. So employers compete not only on wages and working conditions, but working conditions. We bought more manufacturing equipment, which makes it safer, allows people to make more money in a safer environment over a long period of time. So the primary answer is competition, but if competition does not exist, really bad things happen. So part of the government should make sure that we do have free competition. And that's the type of regulation that's reasonable, but it's tricky. So now they want to regulate Google. They want to regulate speech. They have to be really careful with this. And we know there's a lot of, between Twitter, Google, Facebook. Facebook is suffering decline for many reasons. Bad strategic thinking, maybe. People are getting older. Younger people don't like Facebook. Competition, again, is playing a role there. So long term, as free as possible, create as much competition as possible. Don't allow any ruthless operators to get away with what they're doing. But use good judgment and keep in mind what the end game is. That would be my comment.
Bob, my name is Stacy Griggs. From a competitive standpoint, won't states like California and Illinois that have unreasonable regulatory strains and unreasonable tax rates ultimately lose out economically to states like Texas and Florida that have more reasonable regulations and tax rates?
It's happening in real time.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen it already.
Yeah, there's a possible constitutional amendment in Illinois which makes the unions all powerful, and if that gets passed for any reason, you're going to see a massive exodus out of Illinois. And Chicago's been considered one of the great hubs in the U.S., New York, Chicago, L.A., et cetera. Those areas are going to be destroyed. We have a major investment in California, and we decided we will make no more investments in California for any reason. We'll go to Nevada, we'll go somewhere else. And many manufacturers will do that, many individuals will do that. And who are the individuals that leave California when you have to pay? They're trying to get to 15% tax. So you pay 15% state tax to the highest earners, and you pay 30, almost 8% to the federal government, and then there's local taxes. So those high earners are going to move to other states, so you have a brain drain, and that has a severe effect over a long period of time. It doesn't happen overnight. So again, I come back to freedom. And if you say, as a government, I have a right to take your money, I don't think they have a right to take any money from a blue-collar worker who's working hard and make $50,000, and they're saying, I'm going to take 25% of your money or 30% of your money. I think it's immoral. I think we should find a better way to do it, because those are the people who are doing the hard work and who did the hard work during COVID. When people in offices were sitting home expecting somebody to deliver their food, pick up their trash, we're creating two classes of citizens with those kind of actions. So again, think carefully about what your recommendations, and it takes a lot of thought, a lot of discussion, a lot of argument to come to a better place. Well, it was a pleasure being with you. Thank you very much for your very attentive group, and it was a joy to be with you.